Eleanor Vance had worked 30 years for this stretch of silence. 30 years spent in fluorescent lighting, managing corporate accounts that bled her dry of personality and patience. She cashed out 2 years ago, bought the house on the outskirts of the Silver Lakes community, and installed the pool, not as a social hub, but as a deep, glittering rectangle of absolute peace. The house sat on a corner lot, but a towering, expensive cedar fence, 6 feet of solid, seamless wood, promised privacy. The pool was her decompression chamber, a place where the sound of the world was replaced by the muffled roar of the filter and the gentle lap of water against tile. The first sign of the intrusion was subtle, an insult only she would notice. It was a Tuesday afternoon, mid-July. She had spent the morning working on her manuscript in the shaded lanai, the only sounds the whir of the air conditioning and the chirp of cicadas. When she went out for her usual 4 p.m. swim, the stillness felt wrong. Her towel, a heavy cream-colored linen blend, was draped carelessly over a wrought-iron chair. She hadn't left it there. She had specifically placed it on the small teak bench near the sliding door. She walked the perimeter of the pool deck, her sandals crunching on the perfect bone-white aggregate. There, near the shallow end, a faint, muddy outline, 3 distinct, clumsy footprints that vanished as the sun dried them. They weren't hers. Her heart started a slow, heavy drumbeat of disbelief. A forgotten pair of cheap sunglasses lay abandoned near the diving board, a lens scratched and foggy. They were fluorescent pink plastic, definitely not hers. Eleanor didn't panic. She was too seasoned for panic. She felt something far more corrosive, violation. Her sanctuary had been breached, not by a burglar looking for silver, but by trespassers seeking careless leisure. She picked up the glasses with a meticulous tissue, dropped them into the trash bin, and cleaned the deck aggressively with the hose. She told herself it was kids, a one-off mistake, a lost ball incident. But the next time was not a mistake. 2 days later, on Thursday, the evidence was bolder. The large inflatable swan float, which she used maybe once a season, was now floating upside down near the skimmer. Worse, a plastic 6-pack ring lay draped over the diving board like a crown of thorns, a few beads of condensation still clinging to the cheap plastic. She could smell the faint, sour tang of cheap beer. She didn't clean the deck this time. She sat on the edge of the lanai, hidden by the shadow of the house, and watched the pool. It felt like watching a crime scene. At 7:45 p.m., just as the sun dipped low enough to cast long, golden-orange shadows across the yard, she heard it. A distinct, rhythmic thud from the far side of the cedar fence, followed by a grunt and a hiss of air. She rose silently, moving on instinct. She reached the sliding glass door and pressed her face against the pane. The fence was 8 feet from the pool's edge. Standing dripping wet on her pristine deck were 2 figures. One, a teenage boy with chlorine-wet hair sticking up like grass, was pulling a slightly older girl over the cedar fence. The girl landed with another careless thud that shook the deck railing. They were laughing, not nervously, but with a brazen, entitled volume that suggested they believed they owned the silence. The boy, tall, lanky, maybe 18, dove back into the deep end without checking the depth, letting out a loud, whooping shout. The girl, slightly older, sat on the edge, pulling her damp, bleached hair into a messy bun. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the invasion. It was the casual, arrogant repetition of the offense. They weren't testing boundaries. They had already established a routine. She pushed the sliding door open, the grating sound of the rollers slicing through the humid evening air. "Get out!" she said. The sound was too small, too high-pitched. It was the sound of a woman who hadn't raised her voice in years. The boy surfaced, shaking water from his face, looking utterly unconcerned. The girl on the edge didn't even turn around right away. "Oh, hey," the boy said, wiping his eyes. He didn't look scared or guilty. He looked mildly inconvenienced. "Didn't think you were home, Mrs. Vance." Mrs. Vance, they knew her name. They knew who lived here. "You are trespassing," Eleanor said, forcing her voice down into a steady, authoritative register she hadn't needed since she fired her last vice president. "This is private property. You need to get out of my pool now." The girl finally turned, giving Eleanor a lazy, dismissive look. She was maybe 20, dressed in a neon orange bikini that was already fading in the sun. "Chill, Eleanor," she said, using Eleanor's first name with a familiarity that felt like a slap. "We're just cooling off. The Petersons' pump broke again. This water is going to waste anyway." "It's not going to waste. It's mine." Eleanor felt a heat rising in her chest, a mixture of outrage and sheer helplessness. "I pay for the chemicals, the electricity, the water. The Petersons' pump is their problem." The boy shrugged, floating idly. "Yeah, but your pool's better." He gave her a smirk that was half apology, half challenge. "We're just borrowing it. We'll be gone in 5 minutes." "You will be gone right now," Eleanor corrected, taking 2 steps closer to the edge. "If you don't climb out of there in 60 seconds, I will call the police." The boy's smirk didn't waver. "You really gonna call the cops on 2 neighbors for swimming? You're gonna love explaining that to Officer Doyle." He clearly thought the threat was hollow. The girl rolled her eyes and dipped her feet back in the water. This was the core of the problem. They were counting on her respectability, her sense of community, and her aversion to making a scene. 55 seconds, Eleanor said, pulling her phone from her pocket, her hand slightly trembling. She flipped the screen on, ensuring the light was visible in the fading twilight. The boy, seeing the genuine resolve in her face, finally showed a flicker of concern. He pushed off the side and climbed out, dripping heavily onto the deck. Fine. Don't be such a psycho, Eleanor. Don't come back," she warned, holding his gaze. The girl didn't speak. She used the wet boy as a boost to vault back over the 6-foot fence, a move that spoke of long practice. They were gone. Eleanor stood on the deck, dripping not with chlorine, but with furious humiliation. The air seemed thick with the smell of cheap beer and their reckless arrogance. The pool, her crystal sanctuary, now felt contaminated. She spent the next day trying the civilized route. She called the local non-emergency police line. The dispatcher listened patiently. "Ma'am," the dispatcher said with an exhausted sigh, "we can send an officer to take a report, but trespass by itself, unless there's a threat or property damage, it's going to be a civil issue. Put up no trespassing signs and call us if they break a lock or damage the fence. Otherwise, you might need to hire security or contact the HOA." She put up the signs, large, bright yellow placards that felt desperate and ugly against the dark cedar. She called the HOA president, a woman named Carol who preferred gossip to governance. "Oh, the Peterson kids," Carol tisked, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "They are a menace, aren't they? I'll send a form letter out to their parents, dear. But you know how slow things move around here. The letter arrived on a Friday. The Peterson kids used the pool that Saturday. This time there were 4 of them. They brought a Bluetooth speaker and played terrible, bass-heavy music that vibrated through Eleanor's floorboards. They didn't just swim. They wrestled, splashing water out onto the deck until the entire surface was soaked. They didn't leave sunglasses or a 6-pack ring. They left an empty bag of Doritos floating by the shallow steps, a crumpled wet cigarette butt on the paving, and when she finally drove them off with a genuine threat to call 911, which they only barely believed, they left behind a deep, oily ring of sunscreen residue coating the tiles at the water line. The next morning, Eleanor stood staring at her pool. The water looked dull, murky, and lifeless. The peace was gone. Her chest ached with a profound, bitter rage that felt colder and more controlled than anything she had felt in her corporate life. These weren't kids. They were parasites. They had stolen her right to feel safe in her own home. The law wouldn't help. The HOA wouldn't help. Authority was a slow-moving bureaucratic joke. They had dared her to escalate, and she had responded with warnings they laughed at. She needed to hit them where they lived, their arrogance, their entitlement, and their fun. She needed to make the pool not just inaccessible, but utterly, terrifyingly unappealing. Eleanor walked into her house past the stack of untouched manuscript pages. She closed the blinds, plunging the kitchen into cool shadow, and pulled her laptop toward her. She didn't open Google Maps to search for security camera installation. She opened a niche forum, a dark, poorly moderated corner of the internet dedicated to pool maintenance and chemistry. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't searching for chlorine alternatives or pH stabilizers. She was looking for something that acted fast, was difficult to trace, and, critically, would make someone regret being submerged in the water without causing permanent physical harm. After an hour of meticulous reading, cross-referencing chemical names and looking up material safety data sheets, MSDS, she found it. A relatively common, food-grade chemical available to the public that was utterly benign until it encountered high concentrations of chlorine. When mixed correctly, the compound reacted violently, turning the water an impossible. The box arrived on Wednesday, 2 days after Eleanor placed the order. It was large and unmarked, delivered by a man in a brown uniform who looked hot and entirely uninterested in its contents. The siphon pump arrived separately, a slim, coiled piece of industrial-grade plastic. Eleanor brought the 50-pound bag of white powder into her locked garage. The chemical was an organic compound used primarily in high-volume industrial dyeing, specifically in environments where water disposal needed to be neutral and fast. In high-chlorine residential pools, however, its interaction was swift and dazzlingly visible. The MSDS sheet she printed had assured her of its non-toxic, food-grade status, but the section on skin and eye contact was specific. Causes temporary. Discoloration and irritation. Flush immediately with large amounts of clean water. Temporary. That was the key. She wasn't seeking permanent damage. She was seeking performance art in petty vengeance. She spent the late afternoon preparing. She used a kitchen scale to measure out 7 pounds of the powder, more than enough, for the 30,000 gallons in her pool, guaranteeing an immediate and aggressive reaction. She poured the dose into a 5-gallon bucket, mixing it with just enough water to create a thick, muddy slurry, ensuring it would not scatter on contact with air. Next, she rigged the siphon. She taped the heavy end of the discharge hose, the part that would deliver the payload, to a lightweight telescoping window washing pole, extending it to its full 12-foot length. This would allow her to remain hidden deep within the lanai, far from the fence line, and still reach the center of the deep end, right above the pool light. She placed the intake end of the pump into the chemical slurry. She tested the system on a bucket of plain water, timing how long it took the pump to empty the bucket. 19 seconds. Fast enough. Finally, she pulled out a worn canvas duffel bag. Inside, she placed a pair of long, sturdy rubber gloves, her most powerful pair of binoculars, and a high-end digital camera she hadn't used since her retirement party. She needed proof, not just for the police, but for herself. She needed to capture the moment of maximum humiliation. The next few evenings were agonizingly slow. The sun dipped, the shadows stretched, and the pool remained silent. The signs remained untouched, mocking her. Had the Peterson kids been scared off? Had the HOA actually done something? Eleanor paced her living room, feeling the tight coil of her tension start to loosen, dangerously close to snapping. She reminded herself of the wet cigarette butt, the greasy residue, the entitled laughter. She reread the HOA rules on pool hours, the section that explicitly stated that her pool was her pool. The resentment solidified her resolve. She was waiting for the perfect moment. Friday night. The air was heavy and thick with the promise of a summer thunderstorm. At 8:15 p.m., she heard the first sound. The faint click of the aluminum gate latch on the Petersons' side yard, followed by low, muffled voices. They were coming. She checked the clock. Perfect. It was dark enough for deep shadow coverage, but the automatic pool lights were still on, illuminating her target like a stage. Eleanor moved to the lanai, ducking behind the large, built-in outdoor kitchen island. She pulled on the thick rubber gloves, the latex squeaking unpleasantly. She lifted the window pole, the weighted slurry bucket waiting beside her. She could feel the adrenaline, An old familiar friend from high-stakes budget meetings now repurposed for sabotage. The familiar sequence of sounds began. The thud as someone, probably the boy Kyle, scrambled over the fence. The grunt as he braced himself. Then the hiss of the other girl, Lacey, landing. "Oh, thank God," Lacey whispered, her voice carrying clearly on the still air. "It's been like a week. My skin feels like sandpaper." "Yeah, old Eleanor must have chilled out," Kyle replied, his voice rougher. "She probably just runs her mouth. Now come on, let's get wet before the thunder." There were more this time. Eleanor counted 3 splashes in quick succession. 4 people. They had escalated the invasion, showing utter contempt for her signs and her threat. Now, Eleanor thought. The moment was absolute. She slowly extended the telescoping pole, pushing the end of the discharge hose over the aggregate deck, across the 3 feet of open space and over the water. The 4 figures were huddled near the middle of the deep end, playing a childish game of splash tag. Their backs were mostly to the lanai, the pole extended perfectly, placing the opening of the hose directly above the center of the pool, 3 feet below the surface. She held it steady. She reached down, her gloved hand finding the trigger button on the siphon pump. Whirr! The sound of the small motor, muffled though it was by the kitchen island, was shockingly loud in the silence. Kyle immediately stopped splashing. "What was that?" Lacey treaded water, twisting her head around. "Sounded like the filter. Wait, no, the filter's off." Eleanor held her breath, gripping the pole so hard her muscles screamed. The pump whirred, sucking the thick, chemical slurry out of the bucket and forcing it down the hose. 19 seconds. The trespassers were starting to swim toward the shallow end, uneasy. Then it happened. The chemical hit the high chlorine water with a concentrated force. It didn't fizz. It didn't smoke. It erupted, a terrifying bioluminescent. Emerald green bloomed from the point of entry, spreading outward like a shockwave. It wasn't the pale, sickly green of pond water or algae. It was the hostile, vibrant color of industrial poison, a shade that looked wrong, impossible, and absolutely unnatural under the LED pool lights. "What the hell?" Kyle yelled, his voice cracking with genuine fear. He was submerged up to his chest in the green cloud. Lacey shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure terror. "Oh my God, what is that? Is that acid?" The emerald color spread, instantly consuming the bright blue water. Within 5 seconds, the entire pool was glowing with a dangerous radioactive hue, and then the second effect began. The powder, though harmless, was reacting with their skin oils and the chlorine residue, triggering the intense, temporary irritation. It felt less like a chemical burn, and more like being submerged in stinging nettles. "It burns! Get out! Get out!" one of the younger boys yelled, scrambling frantically for the ladder. Kyle, his face distorted with panic, tried to swim, but the water felt wrong. Thick, clinging, and corrosive. He scrambled onto the deck, leaving brilliant, glowing green footprints on the aggregate. Lacey vaulted out, gagging and clutching her eyes. "My eyes! My eyes are stinging!" Her neon orange bikini was instantly stained a bizarre, permanent teal where the green water had contacted the fabric. Eleanor watched them, cold and utterly detached. As the last of the slurry was sucked from the bucket, she quickly hit the kill switch on the pump, reeling the hose and pole back toward the shadows. The 4 trespassers were now stumbling around her deck, blinded by panic and the stinging chemical. They looked monstrous, their bodies tinted green, their wet hair matted to their heads. "We need a shower! Where's the hose?" Lacey screamed, grabbing Kyle's arm. "The fence! Come on!" Kyle barked, stumbling towards the cedar barrier. Eleanor silently raised the camera, her hands steady. Click, click, click. She captured the green. Panicked faces, the staining on the expensive aggregate, and the moment Kyle violently shoved Lacey back over the fence in his hurry to escape. The pool itself was a spectacular, silent testament to her resolve, a massive, glowing block of toxic green that promised severe consequences. Within 30 seconds, the yard was silent again, save for the faint, desperate sounds of coughing and running water coming from the general direction of the Peterson house. Eleanor lowered the camera, her heart hammering a victory drum against her ribs. Justice. It was cold, immediate, and overwhelmingly effective. They would never, ever risk entering that water again. The humiliation was profound, the photographic. Evidence was undeniable, and the damage was non-lethal, yet unforgettable. She carefully detached the hose, wiped down the pump, and started hauling the wet, empty bucket back into the house. Her adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a satisfying exhaustion. As she reached the sliding door, she paused, looking back one last time at the emerald pool. And that's when she saw the fifth person. Standing absolutely still at the edge of the fence, half hidden by the shadow of a large rhododendron bush that separated her property from the other neighbor, was a small figure. Not one of the Peterson crew. This figure was older, wearing a white button-down shirt that glowed faintly under the distant street lamp. They hadn't moved. They had simply watched the entire spectacle, the invasion, the chemical eruption, the panicked, green retreat. Eleanor felt the victory drain from her, replaced by a fresh, sickening dread. This wasn't a reckless teenager. This was an adult, a silent, unknown witness, and as the figure slowly, deliberately, reached into their own pocket and raised a device that looked exactly like a cell phone, Eleanor realized her act of karmic. Justice had just moved from a local dispute into a public observable crime. Eleanor froze, the wet bucket slipping from her gloved hand and crashing onto the aggregate deck. The sound, dull and heavy, broke the oppressive silence. Her heart, which moments ago was singing a victorious, adrenalized tune, now hammered a furious warning against her ribs. The figure by the rhododendron bush lowered the phone slowly, their hand steady. They didn't move toward the fence. They simply turned and vanished into the deeper shadow of the side yard. Eleanor dropped the bucket and sprinted. She ripped off the squeaking rubber gloves and vaulted over the low railing of the lanai. She reached the rhododendron bush in 3 frantic strides. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the phantom scent of cheap chlorine. Nothing. Just the manicured lawn of her next-door neighbor, Mr. Davies. Eleanor knew the house. It was a neat, small, single-story ranch with immaculately trimmed hedges and zero personality. Mr. Davies, a retired accountant, was notorious in the community for his passive-aggressive fastidiousness. He had once left a printed, laminated note on Eleanor's mailbox because her newspaper delivery had landed 3 inches outside his property line. She stood there, breathing hard, feeling the profound, terrifying shift in power. Her retaliation had been flawless, surgical, and anonymous. Now it was documented. The Peterson kids were witnesses to the effect. Mr. Davies was a witness to the cause. She stumbled back, looking at her pool. The water was no longer just green. It was a luminous emerald confession. The heavy storm clouds had broken, and a massive full moon hung high, reflecting off the water, making it glow like a beacon of chemical aggression. She had to move. Now. Her first action was to dispose of the evidence. She ran back to the garage, tore the pump system apart, and dumped the remaining white powder into a heavy-duty contractor garbage bag, double-knotting it. She would deal with disposal later. The pump, the hose, the pole, all were meticulously wiped down and hidden under an old tarp in the darkest corner. Then came the pool. The green stain had to vanish before the sun rose. A toxic-colored pool on a Friday night in a quiet suburb was not something that waited until Monday morning. She ran back to the filter room, a small, climate-controlled shed near the deck. She cranked the powerful main filter and pump onto the highest, most aggressive setting. She grabbed 3 5-gallon buckets of pool acid, muriatic acid, from her supply shelf. This was dangerous, serious chemistry, far more corrosive than the organic dye. The goal was speed. She began carefully but quickly, pouring the acid directly into the deepest pockets of the pool, targeting the visible center mass of the green dye. The acid would neutralize the high alkalinity caused by the concentrated dye and initiate a massive shock oxidation process, hopefully breaking down the organic pigment. The fumes rose immediately, caustic and sharp. Eleanor tied a bandana over her mouth and nose and kept pouring, moving around the perimeter, her arms aching from the heavy containers. She heard the first approaching sound that wasn't chemical. Not the police siren she expected, but the unmistakable screech of a car pulling into a driveway too fast. It was the Petersons. She dove back into the lanai shadows, peering through the slats of the vertical blinds. A sedan, probably the Peterson family's old beat-up Volvo, screeched to a halt across the street. A woman, Mrs. Peterson, and a man, Mr. Peterson, tumbled out. Mrs. Peterson was already yelling, her voice raw and panicked. "Kyle! Lacey! What is wrong with you? What did you do?" Kyle and Lacey, still looking blotchy and faintly green under the streetlights, were huddled on their porch, wrapped in towels. "We didn't do anything," Kyle shrieked, clearly still stinging and terrified. "It was Eleanor. She poisoned the pool. It turned green and burned us." The parents rushed over, inspecting their kids with a mixture of confusion and horror. They saw the remnants of the green stain on their children's skin, the ruined bikini, and, more importantly, the genuine, deep-seated fear in their eyes. Mr. Peterson, a heavy man in a golf shirt, looked across the street toward Eleanor's dark, silent house. He squinted at the glowing emerald pool, a sight impossible to misinterpret as anything other than deliberate malice. Eleanor watched, her camera still clutched in her hand. She heard Mr. Peterson shout, "This isn't over, Eleanor. You hear me? This is assault! Chemical assault!" She held her position, silent, unmoving. She knew a direct confrontation would only escalate the situation into a reportable incident. If they called the police now, they would have two witnesses, the kids, claiming assault, and the evidence, the pool, was undeniable. They didn't call the police. The Petersons, Eleanor realized with a chilling clarity, were almost as scared of involving the police as she was. They had been teaching their kids to trespass, to disregard boundaries. If the police came, they might face charges for contributing to delinquency or petty theft, the beer rings. They wanted retaliation, not justice. They retreated inside their house to deal with the chemical burns and stained clothes. The front door slammed shut, leaving Eleanor alone with the glow of her green mistake. By 4:00 a.m., Eleanor had cycled and backwashed the filter 3 times, dumping thousands of gallons of neon green water into the side yard drain. She added industrial flocculants to bond the remaining dye particles and dropped in 3 giant filter clarifiers. The glowing emerald was fading, replaced by a milky, cloudy blue-green, still noticeable, but no longer radioactive. She had bought herself a few hours. At 7 a.m., just as the first weak light of dawn filtered through the humidity, the bell rang. Not the frantic, demanding ring of a neighbor, but a single, measured, polite chime. Eleanor had showered, dressed in a crisp white linen shirt and jeans, and composed her face into a mask of serene neutrality. She opened the door, standing on her welcome mat, holding a briefcase and wearing an ironed, pale blue polo shirt. Was Mr. Davies. He had the unsettling stillness of a man who waits for the perfect moment to move. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and even, completely devoid of neighborly warmth. "You seem surprised." "Mr. Davies?" she replied, her voice steady. "I apologize for the noise last night. We had a chemical spill. A massive backwash issue with the filter system." He gave her a slight, slow smile that was colder than any frown. "Is that what you call it?" "I call it an unlicensed dispersal of an irritant dye into a community water source, captured on high-definition video." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. "You were the one standing by the rhododendron." "Indeed." "I was having a difficult time sleeping, so I was enjoying the evening air," he said, holding up his phone. The screen was facing her. It was a still frame. Kyle Peterson, neon green, jaw slack with panic, scrambling over her fence. The pool behind him was a sheet of glowing poison. "It's quite cinematic, actually. Excellent resolution, even in low light. What do you want?" Eleanor cut to the chase, the corporate ruthlessness rising to meet his cold control. "What I want, Eleanor, is quiet. What I need is stability. What I see is a high-risk liability and a potential criminal charge for you. The police, the HOA, the Petersons, they are all problems. But they are my problems now, too. He opened his briefcase, revealing a single manila envelope. I am not interested in blackmail, Eleanor. I am interested in leverage. Consider this my opening offer in a mutual defense pact. He handed her the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a highly detailed, professional-grade survey map of their shared property line, signed and notarized by a land surveyor. The map showed a critical, overlooked detail. The corner of Eleanor's cedar fence encroached 5 inches onto Mr. Davies's property, specifically where his prize-winning rhododendron bush was planted. For years, Mr. Davies said, his eyes never leaving hers. That fence has been a thorn in my side. It's too high. It blocks light from my garden, and as you can see, it violates the setback. If I turn this video over to the police, you face battery and chemical dispersal charges, potentially a major fine from the EPA, and the Petersons sue you for their medical bills and ruined swimwear. He paused, letting the weight of the consequences settle. If I keep this video and provide a carefully worded, neutral statement to the Petersons and the HOA, a statement that says you were merely backwashing the filter and that the pool looked strange due to a chemical imbalance, which is what the kids stumbled into. We can all walk away. He tapped the survey map. My price is simple, Eleanor. You move the entire cedar fence back 6 inches by the end of the month, pay for the new survey lines, and sign a mutual notarized non-disclosure agreement that this event never happened. No police, no HOA involvement, no video. Your secret dies with me. Eleanor looked from the map, which clearly showed her fence's error, to the cool, unblinking eyes of her neighbor. He wasn't a vigilante. He was an opportunist. He wasn't asking for cash. He was taking back his boundary, leveraging her fear of a criminal record. She had thought her revenge was complete, but Mr. Davies had just revealed the true cost. Her private battle had been escalated into a high-stakes real estate negotiation. She had finally achieved silence in her pool, but now she had a powerful, demanding new enemy, and he owned the one piece of evidence that could destroy her retirement. The meeting with Mr. Davies took place at the local notary's office on Monday morning, a neutral ground where corporate contracts replaced neighborly pleasantries. Eleanor arrived in a precisely tailored suit, the uniform of the ruthless negotiator she once was, hiding the exhaustion that still clung to her from the weekend's chemical cleanup. Mr. Davies was already there, meticulously reviewing documents, his posture stiff and impeccable. He did not offer coffee or small talk. He simply opened a second, more expansive folder containing the drafted mutual non-disclosure and indemnity agreement. I have taken the liberty of drafting the necessary documents. Eleanor, he stated, adjusting his glasses. The terms are precisely as discussed. The Peterson children's parents have been contacted, with an uncharacteristically sympathetic letter from me. I explained the unfortunate situation as a pool pump malfunction, leading to a temporary chemical reaction, which they, regrettably, encountered during an uninvited swim. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, observing him. He was enjoying this far too much. He wasn't just fastidious. He was a control enthusiast who had finally found the perfect lever. You've been busy, Eleanor noted, her voice flat. The Petersons accepted this explanation? They were surprisingly amenable, Davies said with a slight dry smile. You see, Eleanor, they realized that by claiming their children were trespassing and by admitting they were complicit in facilitating that trespass, their legal position against you becomes quite weak. They prefer a silent, mutual retreat. They are now, however, quite motivated to see that fence moved. It symbolizes their defeat as much as your guilt. And the video? Davies tapped the hard drive connected to his laptop. The original video and all copies will be handed over to you the moment the new fence posts are dry set and the new notarized boundary markers are in place. The deadline remains the end of the month. Eleanor tried to bargain one last time purely out of professional reflex. A 6-inch encroachment is negligible. We can agree to a permanent easement, and I will pay all legal fees for that easement. This saves me tens of thousands in contractor costs and preserves the current fence. Davies closed his folder with a sharp snap. No, the fence is wrong. It has been wrong for 9 years. I want it gone. And I want the new one built correctly on the new line. That 6 inches is not negligible to me. It is the physical manifestation of order. My terms are non-negotiable, Eleanor. You pay the price or I share the video. Choose. Eleanor didn't hesitate. The thought of the video, the visual evidence of her cold, calculated chemical assault, circulating, was intolerable. It wasn't just a criminal risk. It was a character assassination. Fine, she said, pulling a pen from her jacket pocket. I accept your terms. She spent the next 20 minutes reading every clause of the NDA, inserting her initials next to the most aggressive language about liquidated damages for disclosure. When she signed the document, she didn't just feel defeated. She felt a cold, simmering determination. Davies thought he had won. But in her world, leverage only worked if the target was predictable. She would satisfy his terms, but she would also find the weakness in his armor. What exactly does he need to hide that this fence has been protecting for 9 years? The fence teardown began 2 days later, on a sweltering Tuesday. Eleanor hired the most discreet, fastest crew she could find, a team of 4 silent, sun-baked men who specialized in emergency boundary work. The noise was instantaneous and profound. The sharp, screeching tier of wood being separated from wood, the jarring, rhythmic impact of sledgehammers against stubborn post concrete, and the constant, mechanical whine of the jackhammer. It was the sound of her retirement serenity being dismantled by her own costly revenge. She watched the spectacle from her kitchen window, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The Petersons, of course, were watching too. Kyle and Lacey, now fully recovered and sporting a healthy tan, sat on their porch swing, drinking sodas and openly filming the destruction on their phones. They weren't trespassing. They were simply enjoying the show from their own property. They had won the war of attrition, watching Eleanor suffer the expensive, noisy consequences of her overreaction. The psychological warfare began immediately. The Petersons' stereo, previously quiet, was now playing a continuous loop of aggressive, bass-heavy rap music aimed directly at Eleanor's yard. They started washing their dog at the corner of their driveway, allowing the dirty runoff to pool dangerously close to the new boundary markers. Eleanor remained unmoved. She had survived far more brutal, passive-aggressive skirmishes in the boardroom. She focused on the crew and the dirt. The most difficult part of the job was pulling the original cedar posts. These were massive 8-foot posts set deep into concrete footings designed to last decades. The crew had to use a winch and heavy-duty chains. At 3:30 p.m., the foreman, a stoic man named Javier, called Eleanor over. "Mrs. Vance, we have a problem with post 7. The concrete base is too deep," he said, pointing to the middle of the fence line near the rhododendron bush. "It is 7 feet down, not the standard 4, and I hit something." Eleanor walked onto the deck, her stomach tightening. The hole for post 7 was enormous, a jagged circle of pulverized concrete and dark, wet earth. Javier was pointing to the very bottom of the hole, right on the edge of the excavation, exactly in the 6-inch strip that was now Davies's rightful property. "I hit plastic," Javier explained. "Heavy duty, not conduit. It was underneath the post, almost like the post was set on top of it years after it was buried. I tried to lift it, but it's too deep and too large." Eleanor looked across the low, temporary chain-link fence at Mr. Davies's silent, manicured lawn. The rhododendron bush was 3 feet away. "Stop digging," Eleanor said immediately, pulling out her wallet. "Javier, I need you to take the crew to the hardware store immediately. Tell them you need 2 more bags of quick-set concrete and some more rebar. Take your time." She peeled off $500 bills. "This is for you and the crew. Take a long dinner break. I need this area completely clear, and I need absolute privacy for the next 2 hours. Do not answer your phone." Javier, recognizing the scent of high stakes, off-the-books activity, simply nodded and stuffed the cash into his pocket. He ushered his men into the truck and drove away. Eleanor grabbed the longest trenching shovel from the back of the shed. She waited 5 minutes, ensuring the noise from the Petersons' music was loud enough to mask any subtle sounds. Then she climbed into the hole. The air was heavy and smelled faintly of rot. She dug with frantic, silent efficiency, scraping away the remaining chunks of concrete and soil. Her shoulder muscles screamed, but she ignored them. Within 5 minutes, her shovel scraped against the side of the object. It wasn't large, maybe 2 feet by 10 inches, but it was incredibly solid, constructed of thick, industrial-grade black plastic, sealed tight with heavy metallic adhesive tape that had long since fused with the plastic. It was a time capsule of deliberate secrecy. She managed to wedge the shovel under the container and, grunting with effort, leveraged it out of the hole. She scrambled back out onto the deck, dragging the heavy, dirt-caked container onto her side of the new boundary line. Wasting no time, she sprinted to the garage, locking the heavy container inside a rarely used supply cabinet. She needed time, tools, and silence to breach its seal. She returned to the hole, heart hammering. She packed the earth tightly, quickly covering the spot where the container had been. She set the new post back into the hole, on the correct side of the new line, and waited for Javier's return. The fence was moved. The price was paid. The video would be hers soon. But now she held a secret of her own. A black plastic box buried deep on what was once her land. Hidden by Mr. Davies and accidentally unearthed as her act of penance. Eleanor sat on the deck, covered in sweat and grime, her hands trembling not from exhaustion, but from a terrifying sense of anticipation. She was no longer fighting trespassers. She was holding a piece of her neighbor's dark, buried history. She had paid for her silence, but she had acquired something far more dangerous: leverage. Eleanor worked in the deepest shadow of her garage, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and chlorine. The black plastic container, dusted with 9 years of soil and concrete residue, sat on her workbench. Its weight was deceptive, not heavy with metal or liquid, but dense with layers of compressed secrecy. She had waited until midnight, when the Petersons' music was finally silenced and Mr. Davies's house lights were dark. She used a utility knife to cut through the hardened, metallic adhesive tape that sealed the seam, slicing carefully to avoid damaging the contents. The tape resisted, pulling away in jagged, rusted strips. She then wedged a thin crowbar into the seal and pressed down. The thick plastic screeched, then yielded with a sharp, sickening crack. Eleanor pulled the lid free. She expected cash, perhaps a hidden stash of jewelry, or even something morbid. What she found was far more clinical and infinitely more dangerous. The contents were neatly, obsessively organized. The top layer was a stack of thick, sealed manila envelopes, each labeled with a year, 2012, 2013, 2014, and so on. She carefully opened the one marked 2016. Inside were 3 things: a Massachusetts driver's license with a photo of a younger, heavier man bearing the name Arthur J. Kendricks, a thick bank ledger meticulously handwritten, logging millions of dollars in transactions across shell companies, and a small antique silver locket. Eleanor slowly opened the locket. It contained a faded tiny photograph of a woman and 2 young girls. The woman looked nothing like the severe Mrs. Davies who sometimes drove the accountant to the airport. Eleanor didn't need to open the rest of the envelopes. She felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. Davies wasn't just an eccentric accountant. He was a ghost, a man who had intentionally erased himself, meticulously burying his past beneath a 6-inch boundary encroachment that only an act of near-criminal sabotage could uncover. The 6 inches weren't about property. They were the absolute, non-negotiable line between Mr. Davies, the fastidious retiree, and Arthur J. Kendricks, the fugitive. She spent the rest of the night cross-referencing names and dates online, using the deep-dive research skills honed over decades of corporate warfare. By dawn, she had the full picture. Arthur J. Kendricks, disgraced CFO, vanished after a $40 million corporate bond scandal 9 years ago, leaving behind a ruined company, a distraught family, and a trail of devastated investors. The time frame aligned perfectly with the fence installation. Davies hadn't feared the police for her crime. He feared the investigation that would follow if the police ever dug up that fence post, which sat directly on the marker he needed to hide his greatest secret. His obsession with order and boundaries wasn't a personality quirk. It was the life-saving prison he had built for himself. The final exchange was scheduled for 4 p.m. on the day the new concrete cured. The air was heavy, but the neighborhood was quiet. The Petersons' music was off. They had accepted their defeat and settled into a sullen, watchful silence. Eleanor stood by the newly relocated fence line, the polished steel of the new, officially surveyed marker glinting in the sun. She wore a simple, unadorned black dress, giving her the appearance of a chief executive arriving for a corporate takeover. Mr. Davies appeared promptly at 4 p.m., carrying a slim, elegant laptop and the notarized NDA. He looked pleased, his usual stiffness slightly relaxed, the air of final victory radiating from him. "A beautiful job. Eleanor," he observed, running a critical, appreciative hand along the new cedar planks, now 6 inches further into her property. "Prompt, professional, and precise. Order is restored." "It was expensive but necessary, Mr. Davies," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and entirely emotionless. They exchanged documents. Eleanor quickly checked the NDA for tampering and signed the final page. Davies, meanwhile, pulled up the video on his laptop. "Now the final stage," Davies said, his smile thin and triumphant. He played the short clip, the luminous green eruption, the panicked, stained children, the blurred figure of Eleanor pulling the pump hose back. The terror was palpable, the guilt undeniable. He then hit the delete key, watched the file vanish, and then ceremoniously emptied the laptop's trash bin. "Done. And now the final piece," he said, extending his hand for the laptop. Eleanor did not take the laptop. She stepped back and gestured toward the newly planted rhododendron bush, which now had 6 extra inches of space to grow. "I believe you owe me one final item." "Mr. Davies," she said softly. Davies stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "The non-disclosure agreement is signed, Eleanor. I have fulfilled my end." "The video is gone. The video is gone," Eleanor agreed. "But the reason the video held such power has just come to light. Arthur." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Davies's face went instantly pale, draining all color, leaving his eyes wide and black with primordial fear. The elegant composure shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. He simply froze, his breath hitching. "The fence post, Arthur. Post 7. It was set 7 feet deep for a reason," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining the cold, powerful resonance of a predator. "Your concrete foundation was built directly on top of a time capsule containing Arthur J. Kendrick's. That black box, filled with bank ledgers, your former identity, and a certain locket, is now safely stored in my bank vault. The original. The digital copies are secured on 3 different servers under encrypted files only I can access." She allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of $40 million in fraud hang between them. "You don't want money," Davies finally whispered, his voice trembling. "You want—" "What do you want?" Eleanor looked from Davies's shattered expression across the street to the Peterson home, where Kyle and Lacey were now cautiously watching the silent, intense exchange. Her gaze returned to the emerald-free, sparkling blue of her own pool. "I want what I paid for," Eleanor said, her resolve hardening into granite. "I paid $70,000 for this house, and I paid tens of thousands more to build this pool. I paid $3,000 to move that fence. I paid in sleepless nights, terror, and the threat of criminal exposure. I paid the price of order, Arthur. Now I own it. My terms are simple. You will never, not once, look at my property. You will never speak to me or about me. You will never comment on my gardening, my mailbox, my pool, or my newspaper. The Petersons will be handled entirely by you. If those children so much as step 1 foot onto my driveway, you will handle the fallout immediately and decisively." She stepped forward, her shadow falling over him. "You will maintain the absolute, unshakable illusion of order in this neighborhood. Because if the order breaks, if a single cop, a single inspector, or a single curious reporter ever has a reason to dig near that new fence line and find an artifact of a fugitive's past, Arthur J. Kendrick's comes back to life. And I will ensure the police have the documentation to finish the story he left 9 years ago." Davies understood. He hadn't just leveraged Eleanor into moving her fence. He had unwittingly handed her the keys to his entire existence. He had made her the silent, invisible architect of his continued freedom. His punishment was eternal vigilance and silent subservience. Understood, Davies muttered, his head bowed in complete final submission. He picked up his laptop, his shoulders now slumped with the crushing weight of a life of hiding. He had won the battle of the 6 inches, but lost the war for his identity. Eleanor watched him walk back to his house. He didn't look at his prize-winning rhododendron. He didn't look at her. He walked into his house, a prisoner in his own meticulous life. Eleanor was finally, truly alone. She walked back to the lanai, took a glass of iced tea, and sat by her sparkling blue, utterly peaceful pool. The Petersons, terrified by Davies's now obvious silent fear, retreated instantly from their porch. Eleanor hadn't used chemicals to win. She hadn't used the police. She had used leverage, achieving a silence more profound and a boundary more secure than any fence could provide. She was no longer fighting for her pool. She was ruling a kingdom of fear. The price of getting even was not the fence, but the lifelong responsibility of keeping her neighbor's greatest secret.